now, without further ado, it is my pleasure to welcome to the first speaker, Mike Van Nieuwkerk, Senior Vice President and Senior Client Officer with Ipsos. Mike, you have the floor.
Thanks, Ellen. Hi, everybody. First, let me thank you for joining us today. We're excited to share again with you some of the insights we have from our latest information on electrification and EV interest from our Navigator study. For those of you who have been with us before, you know this is a series of webinars that we've hosted each year, and we'll continue to do so this year, as well as some additional topics throughout the course of the year. For those that are new, hope you find this interesting, exciting, informative, and we look forward to engaging with you. Chance, if you can go to the next slide. So before we really dive into things, I just wanted to kind of table set a bit for you. And the obvious one here is that the EV market really is shaping up to be very favorable. And none of this should be surprising to anybody here on the call, but certainly when you consider all of the EVs that are now in the market or entering, and not just the number of them, but the breadth of them, the types of models that are coming into market, along with just an unbelievable amount of promotion that's happening. You can hardly turn on the television podcast without coming across some advertisement, some commercial on electric vehicles or electrification. And then certainly the network, the charging points that are available publicly have been growing very quickly. And we're going to talk a little bit about all of those things in a moment. We also have the condition of just gas prices getting incredibly high across this country and in other markets as well. So that really starts to set a foundation. But what we're going to do today, aside from really diving in a little bit into these topics, we're going to get into detail around what consumers are thinking about electric vehicles and how they're viewing it as a potential choice moving forward. Chance, if you can go to the next slide. The way we're going to dive into this is through the Ipsos Navigator, Mobility Navigator study. And this is something that we've been doing for several years now. And while there's a lot of research out there on electric vehicles that's available, what makes this particular study unique is really three things. One is that it's trendable data. We've been doing this study for 5+ years. And throughout that time, while we do make some modifications to the survey here and there, we keep threads of very important metrics around each of the topics we're covering. The other advantage is that this is a global study. So this is pretty unique in the sense that we're covering 5 of the most important automotive markets and how each of these topics, whether it's electrification, which is modules on autonomous and semi-autonomous features, or shared mobility. This is really a dive looking at some of these markets which are ahead of where they are in the US, some that are behind, and how are consumers reacting. The third advantage is the fact that this is really 3 studies in one. So it's not just electrification, it's not just autonomy, which we'll share later, and mobility. All of things, all of these major movements within the auto industry sort of coming together. Chance, can you go to the next slide, please? What I also want to emphasize is that this isn't really just about what consumers are thinking. Certainly it dives well into that, and we get a lot of interesting insights over the years that are progressing and changing. But there's a lot of insight and implications that are useful to many other industries that support electrification. So yes, it helps the manufacturers in their planning strategy, but it's also addressing all of these other aspects, whether it's utilities, oil and gas companies, what's happening with gas stations, infrastructure, the environment, so on and so forth. And it's indicative if you look at the people who are attending, all of you are coming from all of these different industries. So we're excited that it has that sort of wide breadth to be able to share forward. So at this point, I'm going to turn the conversation over to John Kaiser to talk a little bit about the current EV situation. John?
Thank you, Mike. Thank you, Chance. Thank you, everybody. Thank you for joining us today. We're excited to share with you some of the latest information on electric vehicles. We're going to dive into some of the topics that are Great. Thanks, Mike. I'd certainly appreciate the opportunity to share again about these insights. I'm quite excited to see what is transpiring in the market, and just to build a little bit further context about what is the current U.S. market, what are we experiencing. We'll go into a few different things. So why don't you go to the next slide, Chance, and what are we really seeing here? And ultimately, right now, BEVs are growing tremendously on what's available. Right now, we're seeing 42 BEVs across the most popular categories, and this is just a remarkable amount of volume of BEVs alternatives. And ultimately, I will say is that we have seen the introduction of these new BEVs in the last 2 years, many more than we have seen in what amounts to in the last 10 years combined. And then what we are seeing in the next couple of years, it's going to more than double that. So we're going to have close to 100 battery electric vehicles on the market in the coming years across the most popular categories that consumers are seeing. So ultimately, there's not going to be any shortage of options as it relates to mainstream or premium. And even we're seeing that there's also a fair amount of PHEVs out there, with 39 PHEVs across all of these segments is also available for consumers. So electrification choice and variety is wide and vast for consumers to choose amongst. So if you go on to the next slide, Chance, is ultimately we're also seeing a significant increase in the ads coming from the auto manufacturers. And most new vehicle launches are BEVs that are across, again, both mainstream and premium brands and segments we're seeing. And then specifically, we're also seeing truck ads. And as we know here in the US market, pickups and trucks are amongst the largest. And we're seeing with the coming in with the Ford and Chevy and GM with their trucks coming out, ultimately is going to be kind of hitting middle America with a solution that they're looking for. And so I'm quite excited to see what transpires as those vehicles come out on the public streets. But ultimately, what does this really do? This increases the overall familiarity for consumers. When they see them on the streets, they become more comfortable with it and more apt to explore and investigate it. So it just overall helps with that broad acceptance and for consumers. You go on to the next slide. And then further, and this is something that Mike referenced, is this key dynamic right now that we're all experiencing, is just skyrocketing gas prices. That just causes and forces consumers to investigate further, because it is quite expensive, right, to fill up your tank. And I know I experience, I'm out in California, and we're experiencing north of the $5 average. I'm near $6 a gallon in my market, and ultimately that's just very painful. And so just certainly count yourself lucky if you're not out here, but it's just an increased need to cause people to go and explore and investigate some alternatives, such as battery electric or PHEVs or what have you. So definitely increasing the, openness to explore. So if you go on to the next slide. The other element that we are seeing is that EV infrastructure is going to be critical for consumers, because most people think that, and they're so used to seeing gas stations, it's visible, that public charging stations are, have a decent presence. They're growing. There's about almost 50,000 public charging stations with over 100 charging ports for them to charge. But so there is also a significant commitment to increase this even further by the Biden administration. But for the most part, what's happening, while the public charging is needed and is required for visibility and familiarity for consumers, one thing that that BEV intender doesn't necessarily realize is that they're going to do most of their charging at home anyways. But when they're out in the public, they want to be able to see it. They want to be comfortable with it. And this increased focus and building it out would certainly be helpful for consumers, and that commitment is there, and it will transpire. So certainly looking forward to that as demand increases to align with what is the needs for consumers there. So go on to the next page. Ultimately, what does this do? We're talking about public charging, and this access is really the grid. Could the grid even handle this influx of BEVs? And so ultimately, if we've looked at the data, and we've seen some published reports about this, and the context of the grid is It's fairly large, 4 trillion kilowatt hours out there, and it grows about 7 billion kilowatt hours per year. What does that really mean? Ultimately, it's growing, the grid is growing about 1% per year, or less than 1% per year, just put that in context. But thinking about the average miles that a consumer drives, and then the overall fleet that's out there in the US population, roughly, if all of that fleet converted to 80% being battery electric, we would see a need about 20% of the current grid capacity. It is possible, but we recognize it's going to take some time to get the 80% penetration. Right now, just about 5% of sales per year are BEVs in the US, and that growth rate is expected to increase, but it's still going to take some time. It's going to take a fair amount of time to get to an 80% penetration. So while technically the myth is false, but it's a huge if that the grid can handle what amounts as influx of BEVs. It would have to work, I guess you could say, in unison with it as the demand increases, and to continue to increase the grid to handle that capacity. So it just has to have careful planning within the overall industry in order to address this appropriately. So with that, if we go on to the next slide, just as we go into the results of this year's Navigator, ultimately it's just orient you, we're talking amongst new vehicle buyers. And as Mike alluded to, this is a global study. We've been doing it for over 5 years now, so we have key trendability insights that we're going to leverage. But what we're looking at is a broad mix of consumers with representative age and gender per country. And then we are starting to see our BEV ownership level starting to grow. It's inching up. Right now it's 4%. So most of this is going to be amongst non-BEV owners, but we're going to give insights into what is happening in that context. So with that, I would hand it over to Chance to give us some deeper insights into what we have seen for this year's Navigator. Thanks.
Thanks, John. Thanks, everybody. Glad you could be with us today. We're excited to share what we think are some pretty cool findings this year. As John and Mike both mentioned, the Navigator study is pretty comprehensive. It's a questionnaire that covers a wide range of topics related to electric vehicles, really in all their forms: hybrids, plug-in hybrids, and pure battery electrics. John mentioned that it covers 5 countries. So look, there's a lot of data in there, and I'm simply not a fast enough talker to cover it all today. So we've pulled out some of what we think are the most interesting findings for you to take away. I will focus on 3 main topics. We'll start with data around familiarity and interest in electric vehicles, and we'll primarily focus on battery electrics in the US. We'll show some global data, but the bulk of what we will be looking at today is the US market focused on battery electrics, or BEVs. The second major topic I'll cover is consideration and rejection of electric vehicles, again focusing on battery electrics. And then we'll finish up with some data on charging habits and expectations. And then hopefully we will have made you smarter than when we started. So talking about those 5 countries, when we look at some basic data around familiarity with electric vehicles, we find a good mix of results. Look, some things are consistent across markets, but other things vary quite a bit. This first chart on familiarity with battery electrics is a perfect example. As has been the case over the last several years that we have been tracking, more and more people are becoming familiar with them, sort of regardless of where in the world they are. However, this level of familiarity differs quite a bit. Chinese buyers remain the most familiar with battery electric vehicles. Basically, 9 out of 10 claim that they know something about battery electrics, and 6 out of 10 claim to know a fair amount. The US and Germany are next, while Japan, frankly, remains a bit of an enigma. Only about 1 out of 2 of our respondents in Japan have much knowledge about battery electrics at all. The story is a bit different in Japan if you ask them about hybrids and plug-in hybrids, but when it comes to battery electric vehicles, Japan buyers just aren't in the know yet compared to these other markets that we're measuring. If we drill down a little bit further into the results for the US, we see a couple of things. First, it's growing, but there's a bit less growth in overall familiarity this year. But what we do see is that the depth of knowledge is increasing. More people in the US this year claim to know a fair amount than they did in the past. However, it's still not China. Remember, in China, 6 out of 10 people claim to know a fair amount, where in the US, we've only grown to about a third. So let's now shift our focus from familiarity to interest and consideration. What do we see when consumers are asked how likely they are to consider a battery electric vehicle with their next purchase? As was the case with familiarity, we see growth across the board. Intentions are higher basically in every market, but again, as with familiarity, there are considerable differences in the levels of interest by market. China, as with familiarity, has the highest levels of interest or intent to purchase, but that relationship doesn't always hold. Look at Germany. Germany had the second highest level of familiarity on the previous chart that we looked at, but intended consideration in Germany is relatively low, one of the lowest. For the US, interest has really jumped up this year. We're up to almost 50% of people saying they intend to consider a BEV next time they buy a vehicle, and that's up from only 30% just 2 years ago. In fact, if you look back a little bit further, over the last 5 years in the US, interest really has skyrocketed. It's up almost 4 times what it was in 2018. So look, we've got this growing interest. We've got all these models coming out that John talked about earlier. We've got promotions. We've got skyrocketing gas prices. So we should just sit back and we'll be at 49% share of battery electric vehicles in no time, right? Maybe, maybe not. While our data has shown a consistent and strong increase in interest over the past 5 years, the data that I'm going to take you through today also provides, frankly, some reasons to temper the excitement a little bit. So let me start with this. In addition to asking people about what they intend to do the next time they purchase a new vehicle, we added a question this year about what they actually did the last time they bought a new vehicle. And this page shows a comparison of the results from those 2 questions. The chart on the left is the same data that we just looked at. What % of people intend to consider a battery electric vehicle when they next purchase a new vehicle? 13% in 2018, all the way up to almost 50% this year. The chart on the right shows the results of this new question about how many people actually considered a battery electric vehicle on their last new vehicle purchase. And we've broken that down by how long ago that purchase was. So as an example, among those people who last purchased their new vehicle 4 to 5 years ago, only 18% considered a battery electric vehicle. And among those that purchased more recently, about 40% did the same. Now, as you can see, the actual consideration rates, while higher for more recent purchases, have kind of leveled off the last couple of years around 40%. As is often the case, sometimes there's a disconnect between what people say they are going to do and what they actually do when they get into the crucible of the buying experience. And now this is compounded by the fact that the conversion rate among our consumers that said they considered a BEV the last time they purchased a new vehicle is pretty low. Only about 14% of those respondents who said they considered a BEV last time ended up buying one. Another potential speed bump on the road to an electrified future has to do with who is interested. We took a deeper look at those that say they intend to consider a battery electric vehicle next time and found something both interesting and maybe a bit sobering related to age. This page shows the trends in intent to consider by generations. Put very simply, the younger buyers are more interested than the older buyers. That's probably not a shock. If I had asked you that question, you would probably have intuitively said, yeah, the younger buyers are going to be a bit more tech forward. They might be a bit more environmentally conscious. They'll probably be a bit more interested. Well, that's the case, but look at the magnitude of the difference and also look at the trend, especially for boomers. So not only is interest much lower among boomers, it's not growing as fast as it is certainly for the Gen Y, Gen Z generation, or even Generation X. Now, this isn't something to dismiss lightly. What we have here is a situation in which the biggest chunk of new vehicle buyers in the US and the generation that tends to have tremendous buying power remains largely unconvinced about battery electric vehicles. Based on the 2020 year sales, boomers accounted for a little over 40% of all new light vehicles sold in the US. Now, in our data, only a minuscule 7% of boomers seriously considered a battery electric vehicle. That's a big disconnect, and we're going to talk about that a bit more as we go forward. But part of these disconnects, if you will, might explain why BEVs, for all their growth and sales numbers, all the focus and hype in the media that John mentioned, they're still a very small part of the market. So what you have in front of you here is a slide that shows a couple of things. The green bars represent battery electric vehicle sales by year. The white numbers inside those bars represent the growth year over year, and then the blue numbers at the top represent battery electric vehicle share of total light vehicle sales. Look, it's growing like crazy, right? We know that. It was up 31% by volume in 2020, another 50+% last year. Based on Q1 this year versus Q1 last year, it's up another 73%. But for all that volume and all that growth, they still represent, as John mentioned, only about 5% of vehicle sales. And I guess maybe at these volumes, maybe we can take advantage of the younger buyers, but that means 95% of people who buy a new vehicle aren't buying a battery electric vehicle. Again, maybe the industry doesn't need to worry about older buyers like boomers at this level of volume, but as the volumes grow, OEMs will have to look beyond the young early adopters to fuel growth. And here's a final thought that's not on the chart regarding the growth in battery electric vehicles so far. Tesla still remains the 800-pound gorilla in the room when it comes to battery electric vehicle sales, and still accounts for about 70% of all those battery electric vehicle sales. This despite more and more high-profile launches of BEV vehicles from the major OEMs. So far, the gap between Tesla and everyone else really isn't closing much. So despite all this momentum, despite all the factors that Mike mentioned earlier in favor of EVs really increasing, there's still a lot of work to be done, especially for those brands not named Tesla. Okay, so there's more work to be done. Let's move beyond familiarity and interest, and let's talk about consideration and rejection. What are the concerns and obstacles that stand in the way of consumers when it comes to considering and ultimately buying a battery electric vehicle? Okay, let's start at a 30,000-foot level. We ask a question of all of our respondents, regardless of what vehicle they own. What concerns you most about owning a battery electric vehicle? What the chart in front of you contains are the top 5 mentions arrayed by those generational groups again. You can see the rank for each generation, so battery life was the #1 concern for all 3 generations. You also see the percentage of consumers that mentioned that as a concern. So there are several takeaways from this chart. One is that many concerns are consistent across ages: battery life, recharging time, driving range, battery replacement costs, concerns about charging stations. When you just talk to people en masse, those are things that they are worried about when they consider owning a battery electric vehicle. But you can also see that the levels of consideration vary dramatically. Look at how much bigger the percentage numbers are for boomers versus the Gen Y, Gen Z column, with Gen X falling in the middle. And you also see that there are some unique concerns for specific generations. I've highlighted one here. Safety is the 5th most common concern given by Gen Y and Gen Z consumers. It's barely on the map for Gen X and boomers. So let's drill down a little bit further. So let's now focus on those people who when asked whether they're going to consider a BEV next time, say no. They're not likely, or they are unlikely to consider a battery electric vehicle. Why? What's concerning them? Again, the charts are arrayed by generation with the most common reasons given ranked. You have the rank number and the percentage number. Remember those 5 common concerns from the previous page. 3 of them are still common. When we ask people, okay, you're not willing to consider, why not? It's still the 3 big ones we've known about for a long time: driving range, recharging time, and battery life. But again, you start to see some things that are unique among the generational groups. Older consumers, boomers, and Gen Xers to a degree, are more concerned about the charging station infrastructure. That is the 3rd and 4th most common given reasons for not considering a BEV among Gen X and boomers. It's only 7th for Gen Y, Gen Z. Conversely, Gen Y, Gen Z is a little bit more concerned about high cost of ownership than maybe the other older consumers are. And finally, let's now focus not on general concerns or on what's keeping buyers from considering battery electrics. Instead, let's look at the reasons that buyers give for rejecting a battery electric vehicle. These are taken from consumers who said they did consider a battery electric vehicle on their last vehicle purchase. Well, we asked, but chose not to buy one. And so we asked them why. So again, you see some common themes: battery life, recharging time, range, and affordability. But it's what we don't find in the top 5 or so concerns that I think might be most interesting. Look, we live in an age of supply chain problems, chip shortages, lack of inventory. The simple truth is those things are not driving rejection. I have loaded those onto the bottom of the chart for you, even though, as you can see, they're ranked much lower. Not being able to find a vehicle of the type I wanted as a BEV, 10th most common for Gen Y, Gen Z, 11th for Gen X, and 12th for boomers. Not nearly the reasons for rejection that some of those other core issues are. Similarly, lack of available dealer inventory is not driving rejection among these consumers when we ask them why they ultimately chose not to buy a battery electric vehicle. So, there's a lot of talk about inventory shortages and supply chain problems limiting sales, which they certainly are for the market writ large. Are they really limiting sales for battery electrics? I don't know, maybe, but maybe not. We also ask buyers not just about sort of topically what their expectations and concerns and interests are, but we also ask them, hey, what brands do you associate with battery electric vehicles? What ones are you most likely to consider next time? So let's start at the brand level. When we ask people who say they are willing to consider a battery electric vehicle next time, these are the responses that we get. And it's an interesting mix of brands. Some brands associated with electric vehicles, some perhaps more associated with technology, and frankly, a brand not associated with vehicles at all. Look, we see Tesla at the top, that's no surprise. We see Toyota second though, which is interesting because Toyota historically has not really played in the BEV market much. Yes, they have led with hybrids and plug-in hybrids, and they may be getting some halo effect for that because people are willing to consider them when we talk about battery electric vehicles. Another interesting thing that you see on the chart is Apple, right? Apple as a vehicle manufacturer, that's just pure vaporware at this point. But people are willing to consider it, at least at some level. It's also interesting, I think, some of the brands that you don't see on the chart. You don't see Volkswagen in the top 10, despite having offered, the e-Golf for a number of years, and obviously recently launching the ID.4, a fairly mainstream, compact mid-size SUV battery electric vehicle. I think one of the things that this chart sort of cements, in my mind at least, is sometimes the consumers still have a lot more to learn than we think they do. You know, a lot of their perceptions around the auto industry are based on years and years of experience and perceptions, and some of those things take a while to change. We also put in front of the consumers very specific models that are coming to the market soon. And we asked them about how likely they are to consider those going forward for their next purchase. We'll start with the data based on people that are looking to consider a battery electric SUV with their next vehicle purchase. So interestingly, you see three mainstream brands at the top: the Ford Explorer, the Equinox, and the Blazer. Not only established brands, but also model names that have previously existed. The Kia EV9 is completely different. That is a model name that has never existed and will launch into the market as a pure battery electric vehicle. If we move on to pickups, John mentioned earlier how interesting it will be to watch what happens in the electrified pickup market. I find this interesting because for the first time in a long time, this is a electric pickup chart that doesn't have the Tesla Cybertruck dominating the conversation. So we see, again, a good amount of interest for the traditional truck brands bringing a battery electric pickup to the marketplace. And finally, we ask about coupes and sedans. I know they're not as popular right now. Nobody wants to talk about coupes and sedans in a truck and SUV world, but they're still out there. And when we ask about those that are most likely to be considered, you know, it's kind of dominated by some higher end tech brands: the BMW i7, the Tesla Roadster, and the Audi 6 e-tron. Okay, let's move away now from reasons that are either helping or hurting consideration and adoption of electric vehicles. And let's talk about some of the things we learned about charging habits among battery electric owners, as well as the expectations among those who don't own a battery electric vehicle about charging. Again, this is the group that the industry needs to figure out how to convince to get in the pool. So let's see what we can learn from them. We asked our BEV owners that responded to the study about their opinion on a wide range of charging related topics. On this page, you're looking at a rank chart that is ranked by the percent that agree completely with the statements about various kinds of charging options that they have, if those options are enough for them, and who should take the lead in expanding charging station infrastructure. Remember, one of the things that we saw in the previous section is that having enough charging stations, having a robust infrastructure is a concern. So a couple of things to take away from this. As you can see, there's a strong agreement that government entities should be taking the lead, whether it's national governments at the top or state and local governments as the second statement that you see there. However, there's also strong agreement that traditional gas stations and convenience stores should also get in the game of providing EV chargers. John mentioned this earlier, right? When you're out about and in your life, you see these things all over the place, right? They're on lots of corners. Sometimes they're on all four corners, a convenience store or a gas station. So if you have any kind of concern about, hey, where am I going to charge my vehicle when I'm not at home? It's natural for these people to say, well, you know, why can't these gas stations just offer a port or two? That way I don't have to be as worried about finding myself somewhere where I can't find a public charging station, because I can almost always find a gas station or a convenience store. And you can also see down at the bottom of the chart that this is an issue, that owners would like to see more charging stations in general, as only 29% completely agree that the combination of at-home and public charging meets their needs. Again, this is among actual BEV owners. This isn't just a general thought of, yeah, there should be more. This is an actual experience-based, hey, I have a battery electric vehicle, I charge it at home, but I need more, right? What's out there right now is just not enough to make me comfortable. We also asked our BEV owners about different conditions and behaviors that relate to them and their charging habits. And we've highlighted, again, a few important takeaways for you today. The first two bars are interesting. Scheduling at-home charging to take advantage of lower rates and taking advantage of special utility programs. Those are both, the things that people said applied to them at the highest level. So there is some progress being made there. But if you look at the actual percentage numbers, you can see that there's still a sizable opportunity to get battery electric owners to do these things, to take advantage of scheduling their charge when either electricity rates are lower or perhaps demand is lower, to make sure that they're aware of and are taking advantage of special programs that their utility provider offers. Again, there's a real opportunity to increase education and adoption here, which feeds right into John's earlier comment about the big if of managing the grid. Yeah, on paper, the grid can support the kind of growth the industry is targeting if it's managed properly. Here is an opportunity to make sure that big if doesn't become a stumbling block. We were also able to compare how expectations for BEV owners and non-owners differ. So this chart is based on two questions. For BEV owners, we asked them, how often do you charge at these various locations? That is the sort of lighter green or teal bar. For non-BEV owners, we asked them, hey, what would you expect to do? You know, if you actually owned a BEV, where would you expect to charge your vehicle and how often? You can see that there's consistent agreement and understanding that I have the opportunity to charge at home and I will do that a lot. Where we see a bit of a disconnect though, is for charging in non-home locations. The BEV owners in our study very commonly charge their vehicle at other locations, public charging stations at work, charging stations at retail centers, things like that. Non-owners don't expect to have to do that. They don't see as much need for that. They don't see the need that the BEV owners are actually experiencing. And again, anytime you see a gap like this, that's a good indication that there's both a need and an opportunity for education. On a sort of related topic, we also ask about expectations around acceptable charge times. So this is data based on answers to the question, how long do you think it should take to charge your battery electric vehicle from a very low charge to 80% using a DC fast charger? So we can see that charge times expectations might be increasing just a bit. You know, it's 27 minutes in 2020. It was a bit higher at 29 minutes last year, and it's down to 25 minutes this year. What's interesting is that we were also able to break this down, again, by owners and non-owners. And this is, again, an indication where those non-owners' expectations are maybe a little bit more demanding than what is reality right now. And, you know, BEV manufacturers have got to take that into account and make sure that they are educating properly and, frankly, working on charge times as much as well. And while not exactly a charging topic per se, we've also been tracking minimum range expectations with this study. You saw earlier, and it has been the case every year, that range is a consistent concern when we ask people whether they're willing to consider and why not, or what they're worried about. Range is always up there somewhere. So we see that, you know, maybe expectations around range are moderating slightly. They've always sort of hovered around 300 miles or so, but after 3 years of increasing, the minimum acceptable range on average actually dropped this year a bit to just under 300 miles. But to come full circle from where we started in talking about those different generations, we then cut this data by those generations. And here's where you see another place where there is just a huge difference in the way consumers look at the world depending on what generation they are in. You know, for the youngest consumers, their minimum acceptable range requirement is moderating significantly, right? I mean, last year, their average minimum acceptable range was 274. It's down almost 50 miles to 227. If you look at Generation X, it's down a little bit, not as much, completely the opposite. If you look at boomers, not only do they really have severe demands on what kind of range they would like to see, it got worse this year. You know, they would like to see over 350 miles of range this year. You know, that's a lot. And again, that's an opportunity where those people need to be convinced, need to be helped through their concerns about topics like this one. That is a quick run through some of the highlights that we have from this year's data. Again, didn't have time to share it all with you, but I hope what you see so far you find valuable. And with that, I am going to turn it back to John so that he can wrap us up and set us up for the future.
Sounds good. Thanks, Chance. And if you go on to the next slide, ultimately, we're hearing some key themes. And what we see just out the gate, regardless of age group, you know, we would see as range, you know, pricing and charging are key. And it's a matter of focusing on this as it relates to education. And what you need to emphasize is different depending upon your age cohort specifically, because it is key as it relates to what Chance just alluded to around range expectations for boomers. They have a higher expectation or a desire, and that's an element of knowledge, because it goes into, sure, increased range costs more. So it's a matter of maybe they're willing to pay for it, but maybe not. So ultimately, it's about education for sure, depending upon your age cohort. So with that, you go on the next slide, Chance, and we can run through as key highlights of what we went through. And ultimately, what do we see? We're, you know, it seems obvious, but yes, interest is skyrocketing. It is strong, and it's grown tremendously over the last few years. But as we would say, we would temper that enthusiasm because it's coming from a younger generation, and perhaps they don't have the means to be purchasing it. But ultimately, it is it's good to be aware of it. So really, we do see with the boomers, you know, they continue to be skeptical. They're not growing as much, but they are growing. But it's a matter of educating them. It's ultimately telling them about what is needed as you would be targeting them. And we just scratched the surface about what their needs are and what they're possible of because of this, you know, brief insights that we've have. But ultimately, as we get into more of the results and the full results, you can dive in and dig into that data as a subscriber to the Navigator. But so we would say, you know, understanding the customer is even more important. It isn't necessarily about, you know, what amounts to is we have a variety of products, but understanding the unique needs, the unique differences so that you can communicate and activate against them, especially when you're going to have, you know, ultimately almost 100 BEVs on the market. You're going to have to compete. You're going to have a point of difference. It isn't just about having an EV from your brand. It is a matter of meeting of the needs of those customers. So truly digging in on those that would be important. But another thing that we found is this idea of these broader subjects that we just need to educate on. And it's, you know, sure, incentives is advantageous. This idea of charging speeds and getting access is key, but it's a matter of understanding what are those key trigger points per, you know, age cohort will be critical. But then we've touched on the grid. The grid, and this is where the industry needs to be collaborative and working with the utilities versus the manufacturers as relates to even government support, as it relates to, you know, charging infrastructure build out, as it relates to the utilities going lockstep within it. It's going to vary from state to state, but it's a matter of that cooperation so that we can collectively as an industry manage it effectively, because that's going to be critical for its success. And then lastly, you know, as the more and more BEVs are coming out, you know, yes, interest is up, but, you know, the rejection isn't, you know, due to lack of models or inventory, right? I mean, remember that despite these high profile launches, you know, Tesla does still command a large share. So we're bringing people into the market, you know, that are, you know, the non-Tesla buyers, but it's a matter of making sure to be able to compete, to know your target, know your customer. And certainly that's where we can help with more insight related to our Navigator overall. to provide that insight for you. So it's a matter of, connect with us and help. And this is where we do have a unique opportunity with this product. We have been doing this for over 5 years. We have key trending information across 5 key markets. We cover a breadth of topics well beyond what we've covered today. So certainly reach out to us and we can help you understand what that looks like. And then certainly what's upcoming for the rest of this year of us coverage as it relates next is autonomous and advanced features. And then we'll wrap up the year with shared mobility and understanding what the impact is on what's happening in the industry. So certainly let us know. I'm happy to help provide more information as once you're a subscriber. So with that, I hand it over to Mike and see if we have any questions that have arisen that have come through, and then we'll go from there.
Yeah, thanks, John, and Chance, thank you. Great job, both. Hey, one point I wanted to make, just to kind of share, is what you heard was a sort of common theme that in order to continue to push EVs forward, while there's a lot of interest that's being generated, there is a lot of concerns, there's some barriers, there's a lack of education, and one of the frontline opportunities in the industry is really the dealers and their ability to take key people who we call curious, EV curious customers, and help to align them and make sure that they understand what moving to an EV is like, what are the things they need to be aware of. We did a study, and I would encourage you to take a peek at this, maybe reach out to us if you want to talk about it. But we did a study called the EV Dealer Readiness Study. It's actually the second time we did it, but we did it back in 2017, and we did it again last year. And the premise here was we sent out an army of street shoppers to 22 different EV selling brands to really understand what's it like trying to buy a BEV, and what are some of the concerns or capabilities that dealers have in order to help a customer through that process and hopefully ultimately turn them into that future BEV buyer. So there's some incredible information in that study that really showcases the importance of the dealership, the importance of the salesperson to address those concerns that you saw there. So again, along with the Navigator study, we have this study, BEV Dealer Readiness Study. We would love to talk to you. If you're interested, reach out to one of the 3 of us whenever you like. We have just a few minutes left, and there were some questions that came in, and I'm going to pose one of them. We'll see how much time we have, but John, I'm going to throw this one to you. We talked a lot about the grid and sort of the ability to work in concert with this growth to help promote it, to make sure that it's supportive. So just your thoughts, and certainly weigh in if you'd like to as well, but I'm going to direct it to John because it came up in his session or his section. What do you think the utility companies need to do or can do to really stay up with that potential?
Yeah, and the one thing that we've observed and what is needed is information. And I would say it's the communication plan as relates to what the utility is doing. I mean, another thing that's come up, and we didn't talk about it, but this idea of green energy and what are they doing as it relates to support and build out the solar and wind power as part of the overall grid, because that's going to be important as we get more mature and broader is what is our access and tapping into that, because there still is a percent of the grid that isn't what we would call green. And so you want to continue to build that out. How are the utilities supporting in that? And then ultimately communicating that. Another thing that, and Chance touched on this, and this was the idea of how BEV owners are taking advantage or not taking advantage of the incentive programs from the utilities, right? And so it's a matter of making that aware, making that communicate so that the customer can feel confident about what is available to them and how the utility can partner with them. So it's about education. It's about working on what is happening so that the consumer, broader consumer, can be aware that the grid can support this, can handle it, and feel confident with their choices.
Yeah, and Mike and John, if I may, one of the data points that we didn't show in the presentation, but which I personally found super surprising in the data, was the prevalence of BEV owners trying to supplement their EV or their electricity availability with solar panels installations at home. It was really high, much higher than I expected. So that's another area that perhaps utility companies could facilitate, lessening the demands on the grid by helping these BEV owners produce some of their own electricity at home through solar and others.
Yep, no, definitely, I agree.
Great thoughts, guys. I think we have time just for one more. Chance, I'm going to direct it to you, but again, open to John as well. So we spend a lot of time talking about and showing the differences between the different generations, whether it's Gen Y, Z, Gen X, or Boomers, and their interest in vehicles moving forward. So the compelling thing is, if Boomers, who have the most buying power and buy most of the vehicles, are less interested, what can be done to promote their interest? And then flip on the youngest consumers who have the most interest but maybe have the least amount of means, what can be done to support their interest?
Yeah, so it's interesting. This whole looking at the data by generation was a lot more revealing than I expected it to be. And look, there's more to identifying, what type of a customer you are than just how old you are. One of my mentors at J.D. Power used to say demography is not destiny, but boy, there's something there related to age and battery electrics. If you look at the younger folks, you mentioned part of the problem. They're tech forward, they're interested, they want to be part of what they see as a solution to climate change, and battery electrics can do that, but I just can't afford it. So, the trite answer is, hey, lower your prices, but that's a lot easier said than done, obviously. But as you're in the product development life cycle and you're an OEM, you got to think long and hard about how to develop lower priced vehicles so that those people can take advantage of their interest. We also saw in one of the charts that I showed you sort of a latent demand for more incentive programs. And maybe that's something that the industry could do. First time BEV owner incentive programs, for example. When it comes to the Boomers, well, that's tricky. I mean, obviously there's a lot of education that needs to take place there, because there probably are some false conceptions there, but there are also just these really severe demands, right? I want a vehicle that will go 360 miles. I don't want to have to worry about my battery. So you really need to get inside their heads and frankly acknowledge that they have these attitudes. I sometimes think that some of us want to sort of poo-poo these attitudes because they can ultimately be false, like people that are concerned that the grid won't be able to handle it. The grid should be able to handle it, but that doesn't lessen the fact that people are concerned about it. So you've got to deal with those head on with education efforts and things like that.
Yeah, one thing I would further add to that related to the price parameter is this idea of the cost of ownership that doesn't go into the natural education or natural mindset. This idea is, I think of my monthly bill, or what's my monthly car payment. The one thing that we're not realizing with the gas prices being what they are, your monthly car payment is kind of supplemented by not having to pay for that gas monthly, right? So there's this idea of, and it's an education game, right? It's a matter of communicating that effectively. You get very attractive leases, you can get very attractive overall prices, and then you say, and you don't have to pay for that gas if you go that route, if that makes sense. So I think it's education for sure, and it's just a matter of communicating effectively. It's going to take the industry to keep harping on it overall for consumers to broaden it, because back to what Chance said, we're at 5%. 5% are getting BEVs right now. 95% aren't. So as this grows and develops, it's about education, knowledge, you got options, and with everything else transpiring that relates to, it's putting us in a recipe for growth, but it just has to be managed effectively is the best way I would say it.
Very good. Hey guys, great insights. Thank you very much. I want to thank all of you as well for attending, and we look forward to having you in our next webinar. We'll be sure to communicate that out as the schedule materializes. But with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Ellen.
Wow, thanks guys. I just really want to thank Mike and John and Chance for today's really informative presentation. And also, again, thank you everyone for joining us. If we didn't get to your question, we will do so by email. And do remember to please check out the materials that we've uploaded into the webinar console for more information about today's presentation and the Mobility Navigator study. Please reach out to us at any time. That now concludes today's webinar. Have a wonderful day, everyone.